Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Affirming Easter live stream. I'm just going to wait for a few folks to join me to make sure that they can see and hear me all right while I get everything sorted out. All right. I think everything is all set up. To my one viewer, can you see and hear me all right? We'll get started in another minute or so. I hope everyone had a great Easter weekend. Hopefully you still practice social distancing. Um, I know it's kind of hard to avoid a big family holiday without seeing family. All right. We'll get started in another minute. Hello, Valerie. I'm great. How are you? Awesome. Well, let's get started. My name is Shiloh. I'm the Affirming Ministries Coordinator here at Robertson Wesley. I'm going to do a little Affirming Easter reflection today, just a little bit about my own experience with Easter. So let's get started. We're going to read the verse for this past Sunday. So it'll be John 20, verses 1 to 18. So if you have a Bible or you have an app open, feel free to read with me. Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the tomb. So she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and said to them, "They have taken away the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him." Then Peter and the other disciple set out and went towards the tomb. The two were running together, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He bent down to look in and saw the linen wrappings lying there, but he did not go in. Then Simon Peter came, following him, and went into the tomb. He also saw the linen wrappings lying there, and the cloth that had been on Jesus' head, not lying with the linen wrappings, but rolled up into a place by itself. Then the other disciple who reached the tomb first also went in, and he saw and believed, for as yet they did not understand the scripture that he must rise from the dead. Then the disciples returned to their homes, but Mary stood weeping outside the tomb. As she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb, and she saw two angels in white, sitting where the body of Jesus had been lying, one at the head and the other at the feet. They said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" She said to them, "They have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him." When she said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not know it was Jesus. Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you looking for?" Supposedly him to be the gardener, she said to him, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him. I will take him away." Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned and said to him in Hebrew, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Jesus said to her, "Do not hold on to me, because I have not yet ascended to the Father. But go to my brothers and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene went and announced to the disciples, "I have seen the Lord," and she told them that he had said these things to her. So that is the Easter story from this Sunday. So that's John 20, 1 to 18. We're going to look a little bit at the theology of the resurrection. So Easter essentially symbolizes three things. The first being suffering, suffering of Christ once arrested and tried. The second being death, the death by crucifixion. And then the resurrection, the rising from the grave on the third day. Central to New Testament theology is the resurrection of Jesus from the dead, and the promise that believers will be assured and resurrected at the end of the age to newness of life. The resurrected body will not be subject to decay, but with a spiritual body, Jesus' resurrection is to be seen as the beginning of the new world and unveiling of what God is about to accomplish. The resurrection was so important in Christian theology that even the Apostle Paul, um, his witness in Acts is seen as resurrection centered. Paul even refers to the resurrection over 6 times in his letters. He uses words often like cross or the word crucify, even the word resurrection and raised. The resurrection is a key truth to daily Christian living, because Jesus' resurrection from the dead means victory over sin, and believers are urged to appropriate this victory into our own lives. And this is the logic that it talks about Christ-likeness or sanctification, and that's all based on Jesus' resurrection. So now that we have this brief understanding of the resurrection, what did the resurrection mean for Jesus? And what does it mean for us? So for Jesus, he knew that in order to become what he needed to be, he had to face the pain of Jerusalem and the pain of death. There was no escaping it. Jesus knew that this was going to be a hard path. He needed people to support him on it and not try to talk him out of it. It was something he needed to do. Before his death, Jesus goes into some of the most oft-quoted verses in the Bible, such as the ones where you take up your cross or you deny yourself. So what is Jesus trying to say here? I have a quote here. He does a podcast called Queer Theology. He also wrote a book called Walking Towards Resurrection, which is where I was inspired by a lot of the stuff I'm going to say today, because his story resonates very much with mine. Father Shea is a transgender man. He is a Catholic priest, and his quote here answers that question of what is Jesus trying to say when we talk about taking up our cross and denying ourselves. So Father Shea says, I think he was saying that sometimes, in order to change our lives, we need to be willing to give things up. We cannot stay where we are. That can be really scary, even if we are leaving a bad situation. Even if the things we will gain because of this life change will be so much better, it can still be scary to embark on a new journey. There may be uncertainty and fear. This is the power of the cross and the power of the resurrection. We cannot stay on the cross. We cannot stay with the pain and the suffering. And this isn't about glorifying the cross. It's about realizing that we often do experience pain on the way to resurrection. So we don't glorify the pain, but we don't ignore its presence either. Valerie, I'm good. You're doing great. I'm doing great as well. And hello, Brittany. Hello, Richard. So now that we see that Jesus had to go through this journey, he had to go through the suffering, go through the death in order to get to resurrection. What does this resurrection mean in the queer world or in the LGBTQ experience? So as I go through this, I'm not trying to say that Jesus was trans or Jesus was queer. But what I'm trying to say is that the the experience that Jesus went through is oftentimes very familiar with the experience that us as LGBTQ folks experience throughout our life or our coming out experience. Um, so yeah, and good afternoon to you too, Richard. So at the start of this live stream, I talked about how Easter essentially symbolizes three things, and that is the suffering, the death, and the resurrection. So I'd like to dive in a little bit and discuss with you about how we as LGBTQ folks are very intimately familiar with these three experiences. So I'm going to start off with the first experience of suffering. So for me, They echo the journey that many of us have taken, coming to the realization that we were gay, lesbian, bisexual, non binary, or even transgender. Immediately, we begin to think of ourselves as abnormal or dysfunctional, broken, or bad. This is where the suffering starts. It starts internally. I know for me, I struggled a lot when I decided to transition when I decided to come out and transition, um, because at that time I really struggled with the idea that I just hated being gay. I had a lot of internalized homophobia based on the way that my family was dealing with it, the way that society was dealing with it. And so once I started questioning my gender, it got to a point where for almost an entire year, as I talked with church friends, as I talked with psychiatrists, talked with other folks, my pastor, is that I was out as a lesbian. I knew I was gay. I knew I liked women, but there was one little thing that I didn't like, and that was the idea that I was a woman that liked another woman. And so when the idea of transitioning and those who were trans that I started to see around, either in support groups or see trans people on the online, in movies, that's when I started to reconcile my gender aspect. And for me, I was wondering, because of my internalized homophobia, that was I desiring to transition because I hated being gay so much? And that was hard. It was hard to kind of reconcile that, because why would I want to, go through the pain and hurt of transitioning, all because I was just internalizing my own homophobia. And so I really struggled with that. I was struggling with the fact that either I wanted to transition because I hated being gay so much, or flip side, did I want to transition because I was a straight man, and that's why I hated being gay so much. So it was this back and forth of like, do I transition? Do I not? Is it because I want to transition to escape this gayness of mine? Or do I want to transition because that's my true, authentic self, and that's why I hated being gay so much? So this idea of suffering internally really started at that point. And we see that a lot with Jesus, in the garden where he's sitting there crying and sweating blood. He's dealing with this very internally, because a lot of the disciples still had no idea what he was going through, what he was struggling with. And yeah, and I see that struggle with myself, with many other LGBTQ folks that I've come in contact with. There's that start of internalizing that suffering. And then furthermore, the suffering process then becomes more physical or more outwardly. And this happens when people decide to, either come out. This happens when people either potentially find out that you're LGBTQ, either accidentally, or there's a hint or a nudge that they think you might be. And so this internalized suffering never goes away, but it starts to morph into something that's more outwardly. So this suffering happens in our homes, either through getting kicked out or rejection. The suffering happens in our churches, again, getting kicked out, or rejected, or removed from any of the roles that we once had, or even in the workplace. This rejection and discrimination happens either with, when you come out to your employers, you either get fired, you lose your positions, you lose wages. I know for me, when I came out as trans, it was the scariest time of my life, because I came out in just 2015, so it's only 5 years ago, and there was still laws in place that would have allowed an employer to fire me based on the based on the example that I was trans. There was no protections for us as trans people. Um, we did not have any legal rights, and so if an employer didn't want a trans person in their workplace, it was totally legal for them to say, you know what, they're trans, I don't want to hire them, I don't want to keep them on staff. And so we were essentially kicked out. Welcome, Pan. And so, yeah, so the suffering that Jesus experienced is very similar to kind of the experiences of the LGBTQ folks of, this rejection, this discrimination, this internalized suffering, this idea that like no one else knows what I'm going through. So the second experience that Jesus has in the Easter story is the experience of death. And I know a lot of you can probably already make the connections um, when it comes to, hate crimes, or even like the Pulse shooting that happened in Orlando a few years ago, or even, having being gay or being trans being a death sentence in certain parts of the world where it's still illegal to be LGBTQ. So for the death experience, Easter also symbolizes death. And many of us as LGBTQ people often live. I only got my Wi-Fi connection. Oh, hello, welcome. We're just talking about Jesus's experience through on suffering, death, and resurrection through Easter, and how that relates to the LGBTQ experience. And so, in relation to death, as much as there is a lot of death and hate happening in our community, one of the things I want to talk about is the idea of living a double life. So for LGBTQ people, we often create a persona or a type of image that people want us to be. And this is created in order for us to be loved, accepted, or to fit into an overwhelmingly predominant heteronormative or cisnormative world. And so we tried everything in our bodies to try to kill and eradicate this queer self of ours to experience true acceptance. And for me, like I did that for a long time. When I came out just in the late years of high school, and I decided to pursue Bible college. And if you joined my live stream a few times, you know my history of that Bible college. But one of the things that they required me to do was when I went there, they did not want me to transition, and so I had to live my life at the school as female. So I had to use the female washrooms, the female dorm, female pronouns. I had to go on all the girls' trips. I had to learn what it was like to be a good Christian woman. And so that was the life I lived. And then because I lived my school was so close to home, I would drive however long it would take to get back to the city. And I would live at home on the weekend so I could work. And so once I got home, my family, my sisters, they all, used he, him pronouns. I was male at home. At work at that point, I was already out for about a year, and so I was using the male change rooms. I was he, him at work. All of my staff and colleagues called me he, and so I was living this double life of male at home and at work, but then female at school. And so this idea of death, when it comes to Easter, we talk about killing or eradicating our queer self in order to experience true acceptance. And that is huge. You see that in many different households. A lot of people pretend to be straight or pretend to be cisgender in order to not get beaten, in order to not get kicked out. Um, it's a way for us to fit in, you know. But on the flip side, once we, decide to come out or live authentically as our true selves, as being, LGBTQ, then this death portion shifts from the queer self to the fake self. And so once we start living authentically by coming out and doing all that stuff, our fake self dies. That person that we pretended to be is no more, and we're able to then live authentically and not have to hide and pretend to be someone that we're not. And so this experience of ourselves to other people see us in a whole different way. And so that person that they thought we were dies. Where I'm no longer this, gay woman. That's not who I am. And so that persona or that experience that people had of me as a gay woman no longer exists. And now we move into the resurrection. I see echoes and parallels of the resurrection in the history of um, the queerness, LGBTQ people throughout history, forever, for a long time. We see that society has tried to kill us over and over and over again. And these means that they tried to do that is through, pseudoscience, through torture, conversion therapy, hate crimes, even through the neglect of the AIDS crisis. Time and time again, we continue to be people of resurrection. We continue to, even in the face of impossible odds, we rise up. We are often, quote, crucified in a way, Obviously not by the Roman Empire, but by society, by our families, by our churches. Just like how the Roman Empire thought that they could defeat the movement by killing Jesus. But they were totally wrong. And we see the same resilience in the queer community or other marginalized communities. We see this resilience of being beaten down, being neglected, being changed, and yet at the end of it, we always come out stronger on top. We fought for our rights. We fought for gay marriage. We fought with our riots. We fought with our pride parades. And even us existing and breathing and talking, and even me being here right now on this live stream is a sense of resurrection. Because of my life, I've been through hell and back, essentially. And here I am, preaching the good news, talking about the love of Jesus. Being able to live my life and live authentically is a sign of resurrection. Welcome, Karen. So now, to kind of end off on some of my reflections, we're going to talk about becoming the rainbow after the storm. So there's nothing more liberating than to have come out of the other side of shame into pride. To know that we are not broken or needing fixing, that we're no longer considered sick or in need of healing. That self-loathing has been transformed into more than just self-acceptance. It's been transformed into self-love. We know that there will be pain ahead. We all wish that we could just skip the path to Jerusalem and just go right to the resurrection. I know that I wished I could just skip the pain of the cross, and I knew that I couldn't. In order to be resurrected, I needed to face whatever was next, just like Jesus did. He knew what he had to do. We always assume that resurrection would be just a shinier version of life we are already living. But there's something about dying that strips away all of that. It makes us a better version of ourselves. We don't take our livelihood, our pride, or our freedom for granted. I know for me, this idea of resurrection was really hard to kind of reflect on. It made me think about things that I never really thought of. It's been a lot of it's been a self journey, I think, preparing for this live stream. You know, I like the idea that the resurrection isn't a shinier version of what we thought. I know for me, when I was a young baby trans person, I was so excited for, hormones. I was so excited for my hysterectomy. I was so excited for my top surgery. And I am really excited. I'm so blessed that I have those things. But I think the thing that I wasn't prepared for was how hard it was. And this kind of goes into like the suffering and death portion as well. That, like taking hormones, it was a whirlwind. Like it wasn't easy. It's not like just taking injection and I get beard and a low voice. It was months and months of crying. It was months and months of not knowing what was happening to my body. It was essentially second puberty, which first puberty sucks already. So having to do it twice was not fun either. And, I remember driving to school one day and there were a bunch of big trucks on the road, like big like semi trucks. And for some reason, there was just so many trucks on the road that it made me so angry that I burst into tears, drove home, and curled in bed. So that's kind of that was kind of the experience I had on hormones because I was just so overwhelmed with the changes, with adding a hormone in my body that wasn't the it was natural, but it was a heightened level of that. And so I was essentially going through a year of just not knowing what was happening to myself because there was so much going on. But looking back now that, my hormones have finally settled in and I'm in a good range and I'm in a good range, I'm so grateful for that experience because now I've resurrected on the other side with my amazing deep voice, my partial beard that is still growing, my little chest hairs that are growing. Those little victories, I think, make it worth it. Even with top surgery or hysterectomy, I was so excited for those things, but there's huge consequences to them. With my hysterectomy, as much as it wasn't super painful, because a lot of it was very internal, it was still a hard decision. I got it when I was 20 years old. And, if you don't know what a hysterectomy is, it's essentially taking out all of the reproductive organs. And so at the age of 20, I had to make the decision if I was going to have natural children or not. And that's a huge decision for someone at a young age, or even top surgery. I have huge scars that cross my entire body, and it's been about a year now since I've had it, and it still is healing. It's still hurting. The scars hurt, but at the same time, there is hope. There is resurrection because now I'm able to not wear a binder. I'm able to work out. I'm able to take my shirt off. I'm able to do the things that I was longing for. But in order to get to that point, I had to go through that suffering and death and that grieving portion. My body was changing in a way that I wasn't used to. As much as I had dysphoria and I didn't want my chest, it was still a part of my body that I had for so long that I had to grieve and get rid of. And these are the parts of transition that I find people don't talk about that often. And so, in closing, sometimes in life we suffer, but our suffering should never be glorified. Sometimes our suffering does lead to a better place, or it helps us discover strength that we didn't know we had. But it still doesn't mean we should glorify suffering. Being queer and coming out is a journey, and there are steps along the way, and those steps may be hard. They may cause you suffering. They may cause you some sort of death in a symbolic way. It may be painful. It may suck. It may be hard. You may cry a whole bunch. I know I did. So in a way, it is a crucifixion experience. It is a slow death. The person you were perceived as slowly dies and disappears. And resurrection sometimes looks different than what you thought it would. And this life that we are living is probably not what we imagined. I know sitting here right now is definitely not where I imagined myself 4 years ago when I started this journey. But I'm glad. I'm glad that it's not what I expected. I've become a way better person. I've become a lot more humble, and I wouldn't give up this journey for anything. As much as it sucked, as much as it hurt, now that I'm past that resurrection portion and I look back, I see how grateful and how happy I am now and how worth it was. So as I end off today with you all, I'm going to close with these words. So this Easter, while you enjoyed your 4-day weekend, which essentially has turned into a 4-week work weekend for some, take a moment to remember our LGBTQ siblings here and in other parts of the world who are still suffering, who face death, symbolically and even physically, and celebrate your own resurrection into being your true self. May you be LGBTQ, maybe a resurrection of something else, maybe you're struggling with a different part of your identity, or even struggling now with the pandemic. I pray that we all experience resurrection and that the hurt and the pain and the suffering that come with it aren't glorified, but are seen and are experienced and are valid. So thank you for joining me today in this Easter reflection. I will see you all next week on Monday at noon for some more. If you are interested in joining Soul Outing or Haven, they have now gone online. Soul Outing is still meeting the second Sunday of every month at 7 o'clock. We will be doing that through Zoom. There will be a Zoom link on the event, our Facebook event for that. And on Haven, we'll be doing live streams on the Haven webpage and Haven group. So if you want to join that, just type in Haven YEG, Y-E-G, and feel free to join those groups as well. But thank you for joining me for my Easter reflection. I hope you all had a wonderful weekend, spending it with family if you're living at home, or spending it with yourself, or virtually with family if you decided to do an online dinner with everyone. I hope your week this week is great, and I'll see you all next week. Thank you for joining me, guys. Bye bye.